Welcome back, everyone, to Auction for the Soul. This week's Parshat Shoftim. Now, we know these Parshiot that we're reading right now, Parshat Re'eh, Parshat Shoftim, and Parshat Kitavo, these three Parshiot, last week, this week, next week, have within them about 1/5 of all of the different mitzvot, all of the different commandments that are found in the Torah itself. Now, that's deep, that's a lot. There's a lot to unpack there. So what I want to do with you is I want to kind of go through some ideas that I believe will add value to your Shabbat table and hopefully to your own lives, as far as understanding the deep spiritual message that is behind these verses that comprise this week's parsha. So the parsha begins as follows. It says, "Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol sha'arecha, asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha l'shiftecha." Okay, Shoftim v'shotrim. You shall set up judges. V'shotrim are like a police officers, law enforcement. Titin lecha, you shall place for yourself, b'chol sharecha, in all of your cities. Wow. In all your cities that God has given you. So what's going to end up happening is like this. You're going to end up leaving the desert. You're going to come into the land of Israel. And you're going to set up for yourselves a system of laws. You want to have a system that protects you. You can't have a society without any laws that govern it. But here, it's more than that. You need to have shoftim and shotrim. Now, the way in which the verse writes this is very profound. It says, shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha. Actually, if you want to follow along with me, I am using I don't have my chumash with me, but I am posting in the chat right now. You can try to enable background suppression in Zoom settings. I think I already have that. But I'll do that. I'll try that. Hold on a second. Preferences, mechila. Sorry, I'm just trying to get rid of the background and effects. No, recording, audio. Yes, it's already selected. All right. Anyway, so. Let's go back. Okay, this is that. Okay, you have that. That's what I'm looking at. Shoftim v'shotrim. Sorry about that. Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha. So, why, if this is something that society, the Jewish people as a people, collectively have to do, why does it say titen lecha in the singular? It should simply state titen lechem in the plural, right? But the fact that the pasuk is saying it in the singular is to teach you a deep lesson. Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha. You want to have a society that is able to function properly. You want to live in a world where you're able to accomplish tremendous amounts, and your fear about living in a world of injustice. Then you have to have shotrim v'shotrim. The same way you have to have those system of justice and officers set up for yourselves. You have to have it set up also for not for your society only, but also for yourselves. Think of it like this. Okay, where are the shoftim and the shotrim titen lecha b'chol sharecha? Where do you got to put these judges? B'chol sharecha. Why doesn't it say b'chol irecha in all your cities? Why is it only at your gates? You only need police at your gates and not at your cities? Because Moshe is doing something here profound. He's teaching you a deep lesson. He's telling you in the same way you need to have shoftim and shotrim. You need to have law enforcement officials, right, and judges in your gates. You have to do the same for yourselves as individuals. So where are your gates? Personal gates. So the rabbis tell us your personal gates are your eyes, are your ears, are your mouth. And therefore, in the same way, you have to protect what you see, protect what you hear, protect what you put into your mouth. You have to use the same type of enforcement that you would for society. So what does that look like? Shoftim v'shotrim are two aspects here. It has to do with the idea that, to be a judge is one thing, but to enforce law is something completely different. To know something like a judge in your head is important, but if it does not lead to action, it's something that there's a chisaron, there's a lacking there. This would explain a little bit why we wear tefillin. We wear tefillin shel rosh for the head. And that's to remind us that we're supposed to rule ourselves with our minds. And we also have something called a tefillin shel yad, on the hand. Now, what does the hand point to? The heart. Now, why do we put something that's tied to the heart on the hand? and this is a deep lesson, something definitely we could share with our spouses. All heart without action is useless. The reason why we wear the shel yad, the tefillin on the hand, and it's connected to the heart, is to remind us that you could feel something, but feeling something is nothing like going ahead and actually acting on it. Shofetim v'shotrim, you could have all the judges in the world, but if you don't have law enforcement, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. Shofetim v'shotrim means that you need to get yourself to a place where you are able to intellectually understand something and then proactively execute it. Okay? If you are unable to, if you're able to internalize an idea, but unable to actualize that idea into the real world, it's almost as if that idea was worthless. Shoftim v'shotrim, you got to protect your eyes, what you see. This is so much, I think everyone here would agree that this is truer in our generation than any other generation. How much garbage pops up on our screens? How much garbage are we constantly faced with when you're driving down the road and you just have billboards in your face of all sorts of things, on the trains, on the buses? It's everywhere. So how do we create a shofet and a shoter for ourselves? How do we create judges and law enforcement when it comes to the things that we see? So I'll tell you what I tell my boys. Okay, I tell my boys, you're sitting on a bus and a woman comes on and she's dressed inappropriately and you notice, that first look is free. You could choose to turn away after that, right? Beyond that, if you keep staring, you keep looking, that's on you. You can't control what's thrown in front of you, but you certainly can't control how you respond to what's in front of you. That is setting up a parameter, a shofet and a shoter for yourself. Don't just be someone who is just allowing their environment to pollute them, but instead be someone who has the shoftim and the shotrim, the proper judgment of character, the judgment of the circumstance that you're in, and the proper enforcement to ensure that you are protected from the environment that you find yourselves in. Okay, Pasuk continues, and it says as follows. It says, Lo tateh mishpat v'lo takir panim. Don't pervert justice, and don't show favoritism. This is very simple. We see what's happening today in politics, right? You have politics that is focusing on one particular party. It's a disaster. It becomes a banana republic, and that's not a society we want. We want a society that's just. So you can't show favoritism. You can't go ahead and pervert justice. And then the word over here says, V'lo tikach shochad, and you should not take a bribe. Now listen very carefully here. Listen to what it says. Why? Shochad yaver einei chachamim, because a bribery blinds the eyes of the wise. V'yisalef divrei tzadikim, and it perverts the words of the just, okay, of the righteous. So let's ask a question on this verse. It says over here that it'll blind the... I understand the first part. Obviously, don't pervert justice, don't show favoritism. That makes sense to me. I understand don't make a bride. But why are we singling out the wise person? Ki hashochad yaver einei hachamim, right? Because the bribery blinds the eyes of the wise. What about the common man? What about the Joe Schmo? What about someone who's not wise? It doesn't blind them? It does, Marie. Okay, let's explain what that means. Okay, so the word shochad, where does it come from? So the rabbis teach us the word shochad come from a conjugation of two words, shehu echad, that they become one. When you take a bribery, your thoughts and the briber's thoughts become one. It's very hard to change your mind. Someone just gave you $25,000 as a gift. It's very hard not to see things from their perspective. It's very hard not to buy into their narrative. It's very hard to ignore that big amount of cash that's sitting in your bank account right now, or the nice fat gold watch that you're wearing as a result of the bribery. So the reason why the Pasuk is telling us it'll blind the eyes of the wise, because you might think that the wise would be somewhat inoculated to this, right? They're using their heads. They're using their chokhmah. But no, even the wise person can go ahead and be somewhat betrayed by their environment. Because if you're going ahead and taking a bribe, even the chacham, his eyes can be blinded as a result of the shochad, shuachad, that he's taking on your thoughts. We cannot have a society that is corrupt, which is why this next verse, famous, it's on the courthouses in the United States. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why does it say it twice? And you might think, well, yeah, because Moses was a stammerer. Yeah, but this was not a stutter, okay? Tzedek is the Torah's way of clarifying and telling us that this is in bold. This is an exclamation point. Justice, justice, you got to pursue. So what does justice, the pursuit of justice look like? So why couldn't I just say pursue justice? But it says it like this. Tzedek b'tzedek tirdof. How often do we find people looking for justice through unjust means? It wasn't too long ago, almost a year ago, where there were people who were crying for racism in this country. They're talking about, Black Lives Matter. And of course they do matter, and of course we got to protect everybody. But if you're looking for justice, how does your injustice bring justice? Oh, you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to go ahead and loot GameStop because of racism, and I'll show them. I will bring justice through injustice. This is the exact opposite of what the Torah is telling us. You want justice? Tzedek b'tzedek tirdof. You want justice? Excuse me. Make sure that the means by which you are looking for your justice comes through just means. Don't break your laws. Don't go ahead and loot and pillage. Don't go ahead and destroy your society. Oh yeah, the police are unfair. Let's defund the police. What are you doing by defunding the police? You're taking away your Shofetim and Shotrim. You're taking away the security that society needs to develop itself. There needs to be a law enforcement because unfortunately human beings are weak. You want justice, you have to create a society of justice. How do you create a just society? You create a society of justice when people have an understanding of consequences. No consequences, my friends. You are living in an unjust society. And this is why, look what it says, the next part of the verse, Tzedek b'tzedek tirdof. Leman, why? Tichyeh. You want to live? You cannot live. You cannot function in a society that is lacking justice. Leman tichyeh, you want to live? Yirishta ta'aretz, you want to go and inherit the land? Asher Hashem lokecha noten lach, you want to inherit the land that God's going to give you? The only way to live in a land is for you to have justice. Justice, you shall pursue so that you will live. Yeah, don't go ahead and plant for yourself. The verse continues, Lo titel lacha ashera, k'chol etz mizbeach Hashem lokecha. Right, this is fascinating. I don't want to do this. I want to skip ahead a little bit. 1 second. Let's keep going a little bit. I want to go to this next part of the parsha, which I think is fascinating. He keeps going through. Let's look into the second aliyah. Okay, and it says as follows: when you come to the land that you're going to inherit. I'm right now in the second reading, the second Torah reading, verse 14, chapter 17. Okay, it says You're going to come to the land that God's going to give you. You're going to inherit it, and you're going to want to dwell in it. And you will say, Asima alai melech kechol hagoyim. I want a king like all the nations have, asher sevivutai, like are around me. Sum tasim elecha melech. You shall certainly place for yourself a king. Asher yivchar Hashem elokecha bo. That God will choose for you. You want to go to put a king? You can't choose your king because you're biased. You're going to go ahead and have a king that you go ahead and bribe. You're going to have a king whose function and purpose is to create Shoftim and Shotrim, to hate justice, and you're going to corrupt it. Therefore, God has to choose who this king will be. But who's it got to be? It's got to be someone, Asher Yivchar Hashem Elokecha bo, Mikerev Achecha. It's got to be someone who's amongst your brothers. Tasim Alecha Melech. V'lo tuchal latet Alecha ish nachri. A convert cannot become a king. In the same way that in America, a non-citizen of the United States, someone who was not born in this country, cannot become the president, a non-Jew or a convert cannot become the president of or the king of the Jewish people. He has to come from Mikerev Achecha, right? Only he can go ahead and guide you. This is not the part that I want to point out. I just think it's interesting that Rabbi Soloveitchik tells us that he used this verse over here, Mikerev Achecha Tasim, as a source for saying that women should not have the ability of being the president of their shuls, that it should be a male position, which sounds very chauvinistic, and certainly definitely not the common practice today. There are plenty of Orthodox synagogues that have women as their presidents and other leadership roles. So the question is why? He explains it. This is actually fascinating. He says that the reason why the Torah specifically wants a male for the role of king is because the nature of most women is that they are kind and soft, that they are compassionate, that they are inclusive, that they are super sensitive. And there's a certain level of viciousness that we need our king to have to protect our society. And therefore, we don't want to burden a woman whose nature is not vicious. We don't want her to take that role. We want the male to take that role. Whether or not you agree with that or not, but that's his explanation as to why it's got to be specifically a male king and not a female king. How? Now, the Torah gives us a caveat. You want the king? No problem. But, rak, lo yarbe lo susim velo yeshiv et ha'am mitzrayma. Right? He cannot have many horses, so that they will not come back to the land of Egypt. Egypt was known for its pedigree of horses, and God is telling them, you're going to have too many horses, you're going to want to go back and get the best horses, because I don't want a horse. I want the fastest, the best horse. And who could do that for me? The Egyptians. And therefore God says, do not return that way anymore. Do not go back to the land of Israel. Don't go back to the land of Egypt. The second thing it says, lo yarbelo nashim. The king cannot have too many wives. You know that according to Jewish law, a Jewish king is allowed to have 18 wives, something that the non-Jewish kings of Europe often were very jealous of and were very unhappy with the church for not interpreting this verse in this way for them. Would have taken care of a lot of issues of succession. You can't have too many wives, because if you have too many wives, it will turn away his heart. Then he cannot have too much money and silver, or also it will take away his ability to connect to God. Okay, last verse here, two more verses here, and then we'll go back and review. When he's actually appointed on his throne, katav lo et mishneh Torah. He has to write himself a Torah. He's got to write. He has to have two copies. Okay, katav lo et mishneh Torah hazot al sefer milifnei hakohanim halavim. He has to write himself two copies of Torah scrolls. One scroll from that which the Torah is placed in the temple, and another one, another one, a personal one that he has with him all his days. Laman yilmad, in order that he will learn to liyirat Hashem Elokecha, to have awe of God, lishmor et kol divrei Torah, to fulfill all the words of the Torah, hazot, the chukim, et elah lasotam. He's got so that he could go ahead and keep the Torah, its statutes, and perform them. So we read a lot of it here. Number one, does the Torah really want us to have a king? And the answer is, look at the verse. Does it say you should have a king, or does it say if you ki tavo el asher, when you come to the land that God gives you, and va'amart, and you say asima alai melech, you want the king? God's not saying that I want you to have a king. He's saying if you guys say you should want a king because you want to be like everybody else, fine. This is how you're going to do it. You can't choose. I choose. And then the second part of here, the second caveat is that just be mindful that there's three things that'll destroy a kingdom. Number one, king can't have too many horses, can't have too many wives, can't have too much money. Why? Because these things will end up removing a person's heart from God. King Solomon, the wisest of all the men, someone who would tell you cannot be bribed because of his high level of intellect, he rationalized these verses and said, you know what? Because we know he had way too many wives, 1,000 wives, too many horses, and too much money. And he said, listen, this verse was clearly written for someone who can be swayed by these things. If it's not an issue for me, a high intellect like myself, then I don't have to worry about it impacting me. And therefore, I could go ahead and have all the wives, have all the money, have all the horses. Now, we know how it ended. Ready? This is how it ended. Okay? King Solomon never lost his way from his belief in God. But what ended up happening, as a result of all the wives, they ended up bringing their idolatrous practices to Jerusalem. They ended up having his horses, and there were Jews definitely going back, and horse racing became a whole thing, gambling, and so on and so forth. It didn't sway his heart, but it swayed the hearts of the people around him. But I think the most telling part of all this is that, imagine the following, okay? Imagine you finally entered the land of Israel, you've built the temple, okay? And now it's inauguration day. It's the big day where you're coming in, and you are literally ready to kick open the doors of the temple and celebrate. And the celebrations were called for 9 a.m., okay? The night before the inauguration, King Solomon marries a princess whose father's name was Pharaoh. Yes, he ends up marrying the princess of Egypt the night before the inauguration of the temple. And in the morning, he's supposed to wake up early, right, and get to the inauguration. But the princess felt that it's unbecoming of a king to wake up that early. So she closes the blinds, makes sure that all the alarms are shut off, and King Solomon oversleeps during inauguration. Imagine all of the dignitaries at the temple waiting for the king to arrive. And they're all there early because that's the custom of Jews. We wake up early. And the king is still sleeping, nowhere to be found. The Midrash tells us that on the inauguration day of the first temple is the same day that the seeds of Greece and Rome were planted, okay? Which is another way of saying that the first and second temple's destruction were planted on the day that King Solomon opened the actual temple. It's true it didn't impact him, but we can't rationalize thinking that we understand the details of what the Torah is telling us about. We understand the ta'am, maybe we get the taste of it, but we can't exclude ourselves from the prohibitions of the Torah itself. So King Solomon did not harm himself, but he harmed the Jewish people as a result of his actions. Now we know there are three famous books that King Solomon wrote. He wrote the book of Mishlei, he wrote the book of Kohelet, and he wrote the book of Shir HaShirim. These three books are often described as books that were written at three different stages of King Solomon's life. The book of Shir HaShirim is a love song, a love affair between the Jewish people and God, and they say that he wrote this in his youth. The second book is the book of Mishlei, the book of Proverbs. He wrote this in his middle age. It's a book of a high intellectual understanding of the world itself and giving you a clear definition of how to live life and be successful. And the last book he wrote, the Book of Ecclesiastes, is a very difficult book to read about how frail mankind is and that there's nothing new. And it's very depressing, a very big Musar Sefer. They say he wrote this at the end of his life. I think that the overarching message of the Torah reading this week is this idea that as much as we want to believe in how amazing we are, we overestimate how awesome we are. And if we don't create safeguards for ourselves in the same way that we create safeguards for society, you, my friends, are doomed to repeat history's mistakes. You want a great family? Build boundaries. You want to have amazing children? Build boundaries. Know what you stand for. Clarify. Where is your shofet? Where is the judge? Have you spent time learning Torah to define what the world looks like? And do you have a shoter that's going to go out, the officer, the stick that goes out and enforces it? That's what the Torah wants. It wants you to govern your own mind, body, home, your kingdom in the same way that you govern a society. Don't just allow society to dictate what your life should be like. You could be more than that. Tzedek b'tzedek tirdof. You want justice? You got to fight for justice. You have to emphasize justice, but make sure you're doing it with just means. I want to wish all of you a Shabbat Shalom Mevarach. May we each recognize that we have the power and the potential of this month of Elul, the month that we're in right now, to overcome all of the challenges that we have. All we need to do is create a little bit of boundaries, clarify who we want to be and where we're going, and you will see that you will be blessed with all the blessings of the Torah. Shabbat Shalom Mevarach, everybody, and God willing, we'll see you all next week.